to this very special installment in the Meet the Composer series at the Bowdoin International Music Festival, and I'm here with many of the composers from the composition program here this summer. So they're all joining us, kind of logging in here. You'll see all their faces, and we are lucky enough to have with us Maestro José Serebrier, eminent composer, conductor, and scholar, I suppose, of music. That's out of necessity. More than 300 recordings, and incredible history, wealth of knowledge, and so we're so excited that he's joining us from New York. I believe from New York, right?
Yes.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you. For me, it's a great honor to be interviewed by you, one of my favorite American composers, artistic director of the American Composers Orchestra, and many other credits. So it's a privilege, Derek. Great to be.
It's not about me. but we're here to learn. We actually we have a few works to focus on, but I'm going to encourage the composers to ask you lots of questions, not only about your work but also about your experience conducting others' works, and the experience of and what it means to make recordings. There's just such an incredible legacy of your work. We have with us, as you can see, probably on your screen.
Yes.
All the composers, and maybe very briefly they can introduce themselves so that you know who you're talking to primarily, but we also have people watching outside of the festival, and other folks who are tuning in, I guess, on Facebook, although who knows about that, but Grace knows. She knows all. Okay, why doesn't everybody just introduce themselves really quickly before we start talking about Maestro Serebrier's work?
Hi, my name is Tyler Taylor. I'm the composition fellow here at the Bowdoin Festival. Graduated from IU 2020. Graduated in 2020 from IU with a doctoral degree. I'm also a horn player.
Great. Great to meet you.
You have to specify when you say IU. I mean, it's a code, but
Indiana University, specifically Bloomington.
Great, I know it well. I have done many things with them.
Hi, I'm Francesca Hilditch. I just finished up my master's at the Royal Academy in London, and now I'm back in New York full-time. I'm also a pianist.
That's fun. Who was your teacher at the Royal Academy? I know them all.
So I studied with both Phil Cashin and Helen Grime.
Great. Great. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I just finished my PhD at UC Davis, and I'm also a flutist.
Great. Sarah, what is your last name?
Wald.
Spell it?
W-A-L-D.
Yeah, Wald. Great. So flute is the most popular classical instrument in the world. Every city in the world has a flute society. And Jimmy Galway is one of my best friends, by the way. I made many tours with him. And other flutists as well. Sharon Bezali is the new generation flutist. I made 2 or 3 records with her, and so on. Nice to meet you. And
she recorded your flute concerto, right?
I also wrote the flute concerto.
Yes. Yeah, did she record that, Sharon Bezali?
Yes, she recorded it with a fantastic chamber orchestra in Australia, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, which plays without conductor. Maybe that's why they are so great. But they have Richard Tognetti is the so-called leader. He's the first violin. And there is nothing like them in the world. They are really amazing. So they recorded it for the label called BIS, B-I-S. Anyway.
Keep it going. Yeah.
Next.
Tamara.
Yeah, my name is Tamara McLeod. I just graduated from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music for my undergrad, and I'm going to Manhattan School of Music for my graduate program, and I play the piano.
Great. Who's your teacher at Manhattan?
I will be studying with Raiko Futing.
So you are going there. Well, good
Yes.
luck.
Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you in New York. Nice to meet you. Next must be Francesca.
They're also polite.
I
Yeah.
can introduce myself. So hi, my name is Shachar Regev. I'm from Israel. I finished my master's at Mana School of Music, and I'm also going to study professional studies at Manhattan School of Music.
Great. I used to go to Israel quite regularly, not in the last 2 years. So I know most of the musicians there, including the composer nowadays, I would say one of the greatest Israeli composers, Paul Ben Haim. You know, Paul Ben Haim. In fact, when I was working with Stokowski in New York with American Symphony, he knew I was going to conduct in Israel. And he said, please look up Paul Ben Haim and ask him for a new work. So I had the honor to say, I have a message from Stokowski. He wants a new work from you. And he wrote it while I was there in 2 weeks. And shortly after it was premiered at Carnegie Hall. So how long have you been in America?
Wow. I came here 2 years ago,
Yes.
but in the pandemic time, I was in Israel, so I'm not here for a long
Great.
time. Yeah.
Great to meet you. All the best.
To meet you. Thank you.
Don't be shy. Nani?
Is it another?
Hi, I'm Nai. I'm from China, and I just finished my master's degree at Peabody Conservatory. And I play the piano, and currently I'm planning to take a year off.
Great to meet you. It means a great deal to me. Until last year, I used to go to China many times, including with orchestras. My first tour of China was with the Russian National Orchestra. And the first concert we did was at the, what's it called, the People's House in Beijing, you know, the great big hall. Two orchestras, the Russian National and the China National. 100 people playing together. And then I went with the American, it's a youth orchestra called Orchestra of the Americas. We made a big tour. But since then, I made many concerts sponsored by the Conservatoire of Beijing, organized by Ye Shogan, you might know of him.
The composer, right?
Yes. And he used to be head of the composition at the Conservatoire in Beijing. I don't know if he's still there. So I promoted his music. I played it all over the world, from London to Glasgow to Central America. Yeah, they are very fine composers there. Anyway, nice to meet you and good luck.
Thank you.
Derek, I'm all yours.
We've got 2 more here.
Oh, great.
I can go. My name is Patrick Holcomb. I just graduated from Indiana University with my master's, and I'll be doing my PhD at the Eastman School of Music, and I'm also a horn player.
Great. Who was your teacher at Indiana?
I studied with Aaron Travers, Claude Baker, and Eugene O'Brien.
Great. Well, wonderful. Looking forward to your music.
Hi, I'm Kunal. I'm a composer and percussionist. I just finished my undergrad at Berklee College of Music.
Where are you from originally? For whatever reason?
I grew up slightly outside of Boston, so Massachusetts.
Great. You know, I used to work there near Boston. It's a Worcester, Mass. You know Worcester, Mass?
Yeah.
We used to have a music festival. In fact, it no longer exists, unfortunately. It was the oldest music festival in America, long before Tango, of course. And for about 4 or 5 years, I was a music director. We brought the Boston Symphony and Chamber Orchestra. It's a great experience. I love the area. Anyway, welcome and nice to meet you. And good luck.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, but why don't we start, because we had a chance to listen to your first symphony, and you know, that was, I was actually surprised that you shared that with us, but it was quite delightful to tune in and learn about this piece that you wrote when you were how old? 17 or 18?
Well, when I wrote it, I was 16. Doesn't make that much difference. It was before I went, after my first summer at Tango with Copland, I had 4 or 5 weeks to wait until the Curtis school started. So I was looking forward to study with Martineau. That's another story. He accepted me too. He was thanks to Bohuslav Martineau that I came to study there. But by the time I arrived, he had left for Switzerland and never came back to America. But so I wrote that symphony during that period of time. It's my first real work. And the reason when you and your colleagues asked me to choose some repertoire, I went back to the early beginnings for several reasons. So if you like me to, can you hear me? Is it clear enough?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, you were just saying you went back to the beginning for several reasons. So what were the reasons?
Well, here there is the reasons. I had 4 or 5 weeks to kill. After Tango, with several students and I found an apartment in 156th Street in New York, and this is Nussbaum, rented up rooms to students, and there were 4 of us. So there was no use of kitchen or anything, just a tiny room and a desk. So, and I had music paper. So I was inspired by my 6 weeks studying with Aaron Copland, although there wasn't much yet to be learned, except orchestration and so on. And I decided to write my first big work, so-called a symphony. What's interesting about it is it's in one movement. And I had already the ideas of why to write a symphony today. It was 1956, but in 4 movements. I couldn't understand the concept that went all the way from the classic period to the romantic period into the early 20th century of 4 movements, sometimes 3 movements, like Chausson. But in general, 4 movement symphony with the usual pattern of first movement sonata form, second movement slow to calm down, then a dance scherzo, and then a fast allegro rondo type finale. It's amazing that Haydn managed to do that 104, 105 times, each one a different jewel, but always using that architecture. And of course, Mozart and Beethoven changed it as he went along into the 9th, especially adding a choir and so forth, and leitmotifs that came back at the end. But I thought it doesn't make sense to me at that time. I was 16. There is no musical relationship between the movements, except the 9th of Beethoven, where he quotes briefly and then answers them. Other than that, from 1956 point of view, I thought the symphony should be an entity without going from one piece to another. So that's why I decided to make it in one movement. It was before I had any real composition lessons, although I had great teachers of harmony and counterpoint in South America and Uruguay, people that had come from Italy and France and had emigrated during the war. So it was a wonderful experience to write my first piece without any real preschooling. And now, a symphony, it's not in sonata form, perhaps it's closest to it is a passacaglia. It has that character.
Yeah, and it also has I noticed that, and it's quite canonic, so that's the passacaglia. But also there's something about it that actually reminds me a little bit of parts of the Concerto for Orchestra. Yeah,
amazing.
Was that?
I never had any Bartók sounds. You know, when I arrived in America, I hadn't heard any real contemporary music, even past contemporary like Bartók. But I guess so. There is something. You can find some Shostakovich in the introduction, although I hadn't heard any Shostakovich. What I had heard, because just before I came over to America, I organized a festival of American music. I was 14, I guess. I had this idea. I wanted to come to study here. And I went to see the American Embassy cultural attaché. And I said, I'd like to do a festival of American music. So they gave me a whole bunch of scores and tapes and recordings. I discovered the Ruggles and Howard Hanson and all different kinds of composers, but no Ives, incredibly enough, which played such a major role in my life, musical life later on. In that collection, there was no Ives yet. This is talking 1954. But I got to know some modern contemporary American composers. Edgar Varese was not American, Varese, but he lived here. So his music was included. I was fascinated by it. So I played it in the radio. I played Varese and Ragwells to receive hundreds of complaints from listeners because, you know, but I loved it. I was fascinated by the avant-gardists, but no Ives yet. They hadn't yet in those years reached the library of the State Department, I guess. So anyway, going back to the first symphony, I discovered that in order to plan a work in one movement and call it pretentiously a symphony, you had to have a raison d'etre, had to have a meaning, a plan. So on my own, I decided that a composer is not far from an architect, that an architect cannot start a house without knowing that you'll have to have doors and windows, ceilings, floor, etc. So it was the first work in which I really made plans, knowing that as the work went along, I had the freedom to change them and to add and to subtract and so on. But it was my first lucky break, that symphony. I owe so much to it. That's why I chose it when you were so kind to ask me to choose one of my works, two actually, but one of them to talk about. I thought I wrote it as an exercise and I forgot about it, but it was a work that Leopold Stokowski chose to replace the world premiere of the Ives' Fourth Symphony, which is incredible. To this day, I find it incredible. It was just one of those stroke of luck. Let me just tell you quickly, because it's an interesting anecdote. I was running to Curtis for my lesson with Vittorio Giannini. He took over from Martinu as a teacher. I was late and I was running, and I bumped into a cellist, big guy, and his cello fell down. I felt terrible. He said, no, not to worry, I have padding around it, but my score also fell down. He said, what is this? My first symphony. I said, well, I'm on my way to perform, to join Stokowski's orchestra in Houston Symphony. Could I show it to him? I said, take it, because I knew I had another score, so by all means. That was what I thought would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, maybe less, I began to get phone calls at Curtis. The secretary will give you messages. Leopold Stokowski called, urgent, and I was sure it was a joke, because we used to leave messages for each other among the students, called one of the most important agents, you know, and so on, and we ignored it. So I ignored it until the head of Curtis was Efren Zimbalist at the time. He was my violin teacher, and he was a legend. He called me and very angry. Maestro Stokowski just called me, said Zimbalist. He's leaving messages and you don't reply. What's wrong with you? So I said, I'm sorry, I thought it was a joke. He said, let's call him right now. So he phoned. There was Stokowski. He was born in London, but he had a funny little European accent, which he put to those days, you know, especially when he arrived in early 20th century, to appear exotic, I guess. So he said, Ives' Fourth, not possible, too difficult. I play your symphony. Come tomorrow with music. Hung up. I couldn't believe it. First of all, there were no parts. I didn't expect it to be played, so there were no parts. Fortunately, my student colleagues at Curtis, and there was no photocopying yet. This is 1957, early October. So my friends, composition class and other people sat up all night with me copying parts. And incredible. To this day, I'm grateful to each one and every one of them. So I asked Mrs. Zimbalist and everything to cover my transportation to Houston. And 2 days later, I was there, went straight to rehearsal, and magically he knew it cold. And it was fantastic. But one little anecdote, I never got to speak to him much, except just before the first concert. The concert was done twice. I asked the manager if I could speak to the maestro for 2 seconds. So I went backstage, he was there, and I said, besides composing, one of my main interests is conducting. Can you give me some advice? 1 minute before the concert. His reply was typical Stokowski British tongue-cheek humor. He said, of course, just go around the world and watch all the bad conductors and learn what not to do. Well, partially it's true. One can learn by other people's mistakes. but I learned mostly from my great teachers, including Stokowski. Never gave me a word of advice, but watching him rehearse and conduct was a master class by every minute. So anyway, going back to the first symphony, it starts as a passacaglia with very moody cello bass line, but ends triumphantly with some darkness coming into light. So, and it has some things I discovered in the way of writing it that I could surprise the audience by having a sudden break and starting again. It happens in the middle. So it was an exercise, and it also won my first award, the BMI Young Composers or Composition Students Award. So that was before Stokowski played it. So he played a part in my life. So he recorded it a year later. So it's an old recording now because it's still in the catalog, but the sound is great orchestra, Houston, but the sound is still one microphone. So I re-recorded it a few years ago with the Bournemouth Symphony, and that's also in the catalog.
It's interesting that you didn't know Ives then, because there are moments when it almost seems that there are these stark moments. One of the things I really enjoyed about it is that there's such contrasts in it. So there's a lot of stark juxtapositions, and especially at the end with the organ, it's startling because you don't expect the organ, and it's kind of a surprise. But maybe we can hear Grace. Can we hear a little bit, if that's okay with you, just to play the little excerpt? And this is one thing I just wanted to point out to all the composers, incredible example of building, in the orchestral texture from very little to the huge orchestra, and then back down. So you'll hear this section from fairly early on in the piece, maybe about a third of the way through. You hear just starting with English horn solo and then building up into the full tutti and then back down. And it all happens, within a couple minutes. So let's hear that section.
Is this Stokowski's recording or my own? Doesn't matter really.
No, this is. I think this is yours from later. Yeah.
Sure. Great.
Yeah, that sudden outburst there, and then you have very unexpected, and but really taking us up, and then you're always hearing the melody the whole time. This Passacaglia, so it's continuing. This is the kind of thing in orchestration that is so enticing, which is the fact that you can carry a melody which just kind of continues through the whole orchestra, going to the tutti strings, then you hear it in the horns, and then back down, and it's but still continuing, so that there's this linear continuity while you've kind of gone through all this orchestrational exploration.
Thank you for playing part of it. I should add a parenthesis that I almost never, with very rare exceptions, perform my own music in concerts around the world for a number of reasons. The main reason is there is so little space in regular concerts, not specific like your orchestra, American Composers Orchestra, you're devoted to new music, but the majority of the 99% of concerts are repertoire. And there is so little space for new music, I feel not the moral, the real obligation to play other people's music. Whenever they allow me to play new music, I always play somebody else's music. And recordings is different. I record music when I'm asked. But for concerts, I feel, in fact, I hate to blow my own horn, but I should tell. A long time ago, touring with your orchestra, American Composers Orchestra, the only tour they ever made, or one of the only ones, which I organized throughout the East Coast. We played the first concert was at the Kennedy Center in Washington, and Columbia University vice president or provost came over to give me an award, which I didn't expect. It's called the Alice Dixon Award for championing American music. I didn't expect it because I did it by nature. I was playing every composer, from the most traditional, like Howard Hanson, to the most avant-garde. And my first recording, I make many recordings, more than 300 by now. And my first record was the first electronic work. It was a concerto called Concerto for Tape Recorder and Orchestra by two composers, Otto Lunin and Vladimir Ussachevsky. Lunin was a great friend and mentor of mine. He was the head of composition at Columbia University at the time. And first, I couldn't understand how work could be done by two composers. This will amaze all your colleagues and students. I asked them, they said, if you look at the score carefully, you see that from beginning to page 22, use letters. From page 23, we use numbers. We are two entirely pieces put together. They didn't consult how we're going to put this note, but they are related. They make sense together. It was a concerto for tape recording orchestra, which was premiered by Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein with the New York Philharmonic, and Lunin asked me to record it. It was my first recording, and it was with the Oslo Philharmonic. So I did have a kind of tradition of playing music by every kind of Barber. By the way, on my tour with the American Composers Orchestra, I played a beautiful piece by Sam Barber called Souvenirs. It's a ballet. Because I had just recorded it with the London Symphony, still available. And I wanted to invite him to join the orchestra on this tour. And I was told by his publishers, no, don't bother. Sam Barber never attends concerts, and especially no concerts that include his music. So I didn't take no for an answer, and I found his number somehow, and I called him. And Barber said, finally, somebody invites me to a concert. So he came on the entire tour. And there is a picture of us together. I'm embarrassed to say there is a book coming out, personally, about my career and people I know. In fact, it's already displayed in Amazon. And there is a fantastic picture of Barber in Washington after the concert and in Tully Hall after the concert. He was thrilled to be there and to take a bow in front of the public. Ballet is called Souvenirs, but I played everybody else, from the most romantic to the most avant-garde composers. Anyway, that's not what you asked for.
So he was being unfairly kept inside by his publisher because they probably wanted him to work.
Who knows? But he was thrilled. He was thrilled to be there and enjoyed it and loved it. It was fun to be with.
Yeah. Well, so can can we listen to a little bit of this very beautiful, this last tango before sunrise? I was going to ask Grace, just because here you're writing for string orchestra, and there's a very different feel about writing for string orchestra than writing for the full orchestra with winds and percussion and everything. And you know, I guess one of those things being the homogeneity. You know, they're all writing string quartets, all the composers you see before you, because we're having a reading with an excellent string quartet. And so, and at the festival, of course, we had the Dover Quartet, and we're having the Miro Quartet coming in. Those are our only live guests. Everyone else is excluded. So we're a little bit like Sam Barber. We're stuck, you know, just in our own space here. But you know, what we've been talking about a lot is the homogeneity of the string sound. And of course, for string orchestra, you also have this, and several of them have written string orchestra pieces. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that in terms of composing and the challenges of writing for string orchestra separately from the full orchestra.
Well, I love it. I made several arrangements, we could call them Tchaikovsky, None But an Only Heart, Grieg songs, and Andante Cantabile by Tchaikovsky for string orchestra, and many others. But I love my first piece, really, to have any kind of sense, was for string orchestra, Elegy for Strings, my first published piece. So I love the strings. You know, I studied violin, it's my main instrument, so I feel the strings, and they blend so well together. So that's the reason, really. I feel very comfortable writing for strings. This tango is nothing to dance. You have a hard time dancing to it. There is no tango beat, but it's the spirit of the tango that it involves. I wrote 3, by now 4. The first one was called Tango in Blue, which I wrote for the National Symphony of Uruguay. The players invited me to come and conduct their anniversary concert, 75th anniversary, 20-some years ago. I wanted to bring them a gift, and I thought chocolates will melt in the flight, so I wrote a piece in the flight, during the flight. That was my first time, Tango in Blue. And I didn't have a title. I asked the audience to give me ideas. I got 300 ideas, and one of them was Tango in Blue. My second tango was Cassian tango. It means almost a tango. That's really confessing that this is not really a tango, except the spirit of the tango. And in fact, my flute concerto is called Flute Concerto with Tango, because there is a tango movement in it. And when I sent it to the record label, they recorded it. The owner of this, Robert Bombard, wrote me saying, there's something missing in the tango movement. It doesn't end. So I wrote back saying, that's what the tango is about. Always ends in the dominant chord. You're left wondering, it didn't end. So in the case of the flute concerto, I did something else. I left it up in there with 3 dots. So and so. But this one you are playing now, last tango before sunrise, is a romantic tango, just a spirit of the romance of it.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of what they call in Brazil and in Portugal, saudade, you know, kind of nostalgia.
It's all about nostalgia. Yes.
Longing, yeah.
Longing is what it is about, yes.
Well, and you wrote it obviously as a tribute to a friend, so let's hear it. Let's hear this. Yeah.
Anyway. So it ends quietly. It has a kind of Tchaikovskyan ending, kind of sixth symphony type ending.
Yeah, high strings and then
It's out. It's out. It's sort of kind of torture towards the end there with all those, but still remains quite tonal. You know, it's difficult to write, as you know, as a great composer yourself, to write tonal music after you've been all over the spectrum. To go back, I remember showing Francis Thorne, one of the founders of your orchestra, the American Composers Orchestra, showing one of my early quasi-tonal works, and said, "You actually put sharps and flats?" I was very surprised because it wasn't being done in the late 1950s, 60s, 70s, you know. You know, there was a time, separate from my music for a moment, when composers in London, I was spending much time there, were commissioned by the BBC. And one of them, I forgot his name now, sent a symphony, and the BBC didn't accept it because it was tonal. There was a time when there was, unless you wrote a specific idiom, you were out. So one of the great things about writing music for your colleagues and young colleagues at this time is that it's total freedom. People are writing in every possible idiom, including the same composers. I know some of your music, sometimes it's way out of avant-garde, or at times it has complete sense of tradition, and I love that. It's no longer, you remember the name of a great American composer, of course, Jacob Rookman. When Jacob Rookman was named composer in residence of the New York Philharmonic, he did something quite adventurous. He started a festival and called it the New Romanticism. This must have been 30 plus years ago, the New Romanticism. And some of his colleagues, some composers were very upset. I talk about this in the book that is coming out about me. They were very upset. How dare you call it the New Romanticism? We're writing music without notes, in fact, just signs and so on. But he was ahead of his time, because by then even Penderecki was beginning to write quasi-tonal music by then. Not really neo-romantic, but getting there. So Jacob Rookman started the movement, I guess. Anyway, that was one of my 4 tangos.
Well, are there questions for Maestro Serebrier? Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, thank you. Actually, you mentioned Jacob Druckmann. Just a little fun fact. I actually, his granddaughter was in my college class. So just a little fun thing at Columbia. But my question was, you obviously these Latin American dance forms, tango, candombe, these dance forms are very important for your compositions. You have a lot of pieces or movements that are, you know, at least partially in those forms. So I was wondering if those kinds of dance forms or aesthetics also influence your non-dance compositions.
Not at all.
Not at all.
The only piece in which there are 2 pieces in which I showed a little bit of early nostalgia for South America was my piano sonata, which was one of my graduation pieces for the Curtis Institute. My only piano sonata was just recorded. It just came out on reference recordings. And it's kind of Latin, pseudo-Latin rhythm. And then there is another piece, my 2nd symphony called Partita, has some Latin elements to it, but that's about it. You know, it was just kind of nostalgia. The tangos were a last-minute thing I wrote. First one, as I mentioned before, was a gift to the orchestra in South America, which is the oldest symphony orchestra in the subcontinent, South America, National Symphony of Uruguay, Sodre. And that started a pattern. I thought it would be my only tango, but then I found myself writing two more, and a candombe, which is my latest crime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? And this can be about these pieces that you saw, other pieces, or even about just about conducting. I mean, it's rare that you have a chance to talk to somebody. I think probably he may be the only person that you're going to meet who's recorded as much music as he has, with so many different orchestras and such a broad variety of work that's available. Just hundreds and hundreds of recordings, everybody from Glazunov to the most contemporary music. So I think it's your chance to ask a lot about that as well, you know. Yeah, Tyler.
I had two questions. They're both related to, I guess, the first symphony. I read the little note that you had at the beginning of the score. And one of them, you know, you were talking about, you know, the symphony said that the Ives was impossible. So one question is you've worked with all of these orchestras and you've done these recordings and you've done recordings of you know, avant-garde music and stuff like that. I'm curious, you know, what was your experience with the musicians and the orchestra? If you have played some of these pieces that were stylistically or aesthetically a little bit more challenging than what they're used to, did they take up the challenge, or did they kind of?
Always. I never had any resemblance of a position. Long time ago, I must have been 18 or 19, I took up a job conducting a semi-professional orchestra, which still exists. It's the Plainfield Symphony in New Jersey. In fact, it's the oldest orchestra in America after the New York Philharmonic, Plainfield Symphony. Wonderful people. For 6 years I did it. I commuted from New York. And they commissioned me for their 50th anniversary to write, or 75th anniversary, I can't remember, to write a double bass concerto. Because Gary Carr, who is recognized by every bass player in the world as being #1 bass player in bass history, Gary Carr, K-A-R-R, look him up. So I wrote a concerto using every avant-garde so-called possibility. I had the brass playing in the back of the balcony. I had Gary recite some poetry by Shelley because he's still a real showman as part of the piece. Violins were all over the place. Flutes were in the audience, but no one knew they were there until they stood up and started to play. All planned. And the orchestra loved it. It was a semi-professional orchestra. The piece was played with the Cleveland Orchestra and in South Africa, and many in London as well with Gary always. And so I never had any opposition. I tell you, there is a most unusual pieces I wrote in that sense where when I was composer in residence of the Cleveland Orchestra at the invitation of George Zell, one of the greatest conductors of all time. And I remember the music critic wrote an article, which I didn't find flattering at all, saying, how come we have a composer in residence for the first time under a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Cleveland Orchestra, and he's still sitting home here composing, he's seen conducting all over the world. I was just starting my conducting career, but I was writing in hotels, so I decided I better get going. And a bass player, happened to be another bass player in the orchestra, Cleveland Orchestra, told me there was an inventor in Ohio, near Cleveland, who invented this fantastic machine called Synchroma, which translated sounds into visual images. I was fascinated. I went and I saw it, and indeed, he played something for harp, and the sounds illuminated the screen, and then he invented a smaller machine, and it was the same thing. So I immediately decided to write a harp concerto, which I called Magic Colors, in Spanish, Colores Mágicos. And it was premiered in Washington, and Stanley Elliott was a composer, the inventor. He came to Washington, D.C., and he had, the soloist was Heidi Livalder. She's one of the greatest harpists was also a student at Curtis at the same time, at that time with me. And she played it. She was the only person on stage wearing a white suit. So he projected things on her and also on the big screen. And the orchestra was with me in the pit, like in an opera. It was a huge success, partially because of the unexpected visual. And the person who commissioned it, Sam Rosenbaum, was married to a harpist. That was his commission, actually. He commissioned 2 harp concertos in his life. I'm very honored to say the first one was the Argentinian composer Alberto Ginastera. And then the next one, he commissioned me to write. And his comment afterwards was, well, it was a fantastic success, but how are you going to carry all this equipment around the world every time it's performed? I hadn't thought about it. In fact, the piece called Magic Colors was just recorded for the first time, by the way, on reference recordings on the same CD that just came out, which includes my early piano sonata. And this piece, Colores Mágicos, or Magic Colors, became a ballet. The Joffrey Ballet chose it to make a ballet at the tour all over the United States. Now, the piece is very unusual for many reasons. It has no bar lines. I felt that at that time, I felt bar lines were an imposition. You know, 3, 4, 4, 4. Even if you change meters, 3, 8, 2, 6, you're still bound by this slavery of the bar line. So I wrote a composition that cannot be conducted literally because it has no bar lines. So the main job of the conductor is showing the beat. So I conducted, I don't know how I did it, and then I conducted the first performance in New York with the Joffrey Ballet. And then Seymour Lipkin was a wonderful pianist and conductor, was head of the Joffrey Ballet. He toured with them. He never asked me, how do you conduct such a piece? And I never told him, but they did it. So the first recording just came out. It's one of my probably best pieces. Anyway, I don't remember the orchestras ever complaining or finding, at least they didn't tell me, maybe among themselves. They said, what is this? It's not in C major. But even in very traditional places, like I made many recordings in the Czech Republic, and I had the pleasure of recording most of Janacek's, actually all of Janacek's orchestral music. And that still remains modern today. Even in Moscow, I did some unusual work by a Chinese composer, Ye Shogan, or Xiaogan Ye. And I never encountered any, usually good orchestras, best orchestras, find it challenging and they love playing new music rather than the same music all the time.
I think that's going to be the only time you ever hear of a conductor having composed a piece without bar lines. because that's most conductors would not do that. Most composer conductors. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. For those of you who don't know, Janacek's, like the Sinfonietta, is really has something like 10 trumpets. It's a very unusual orchestration.
24. Sorry to correct. 24 trumpets.
24 trumpets. Okay. Okay. I guess some are backstage, right? And some maybe.
I guess so. Yeah, some are, but most of them on stage. Yeah, it's quite something. So I recorded with Janacek's orchestra, the Brno Philharmonic, with a great record label, reference recordings. But the sound is amazing, and they managed to get that 24 trumpets coming right at you. Janacek was incredible. And all the operas had overtures. Symphonic synthesis, which most of them done by himself, others by others, except one called Micropolis Case. So when reference recordings asked me if I would make a recording also of the complete symphonic synthesis of Janacek's operas, they said, would I do one of Micropolis Case, because I was the only one. So I asked my friend Oliver Knussen, Knussen, one of the greatest composers in England, died recently, Oli Knussen, or Knussen. What do you think? He said, how can you make a suite of that piece? It's the most unsweetable piece of music. It was kind of a joke. He was always doing that. Because there isn't a single bar of purely orchestral music. From the very first note, always accompanying voices. It was a challenge. And it's published by Universal Edition because they own the copyright of Janacek. and we recorded it. So anyway, many of the questions that you didn't ask or may like to ask will be answered in this new book about my career, which is just coming out. It's already available, I guess. And it has a wonderful introduction by John Corigliano and articles by other composers and so on. And it's mostly a book. The reason the original writer wrote about me, Michel Fauré, was to get to know through me about Copland, about Barber, about Stokowski, Antal Doherty, Dermont, and so on. It was really to use me as a reflection on those people. But as he began to write it, he found that I was not an interesting subject either, so it became that book. So the original book came out 20 years ago in France. It's still there. But the new book is twice as long. And it's a book of anecdotes, including some amazingly funny anecdotes with Salvador Dali, which people won't believe it when they read it. This coming out, in fact, this coming week, there is the official launch of the book in California, in Napa Valley. But the book is already available.
I just put it in the chat so that way people, if they want a link, but I'm sure you can also find the book on Amazon, but there's a link in case you're interested. Are there other questions?
I hope so. Any questions?
Well, I hope there are. I want to leave a few seconds for people. This is how Zoom is, so in case there's delay, but because I have lots of questions if they don't, but I'd rather hear from them.
Yes.
I had sort of a little follow-up to your first symphony, because a lot of the note was explaining the circumstances behind running into the cellist and getting it performed, but I was wondering
which piece are you talking about?
Sorry, your first symphony.
Okay.
If you had just a little bit more insight into what you were thinking about expressively when you were writing that. I know you said it was sort of an exercise, but what sort of things were occupying your mind when you were writing that piece?
Well, again, the book tells a story. I was heartbroken that the girl that I had met at Tanglewood, at the very end of our stay in Tanglewood, decided to give me up for another guy who was a pantomime. She was very impressed by his, like Marcel Marceau was the most famous pantomime artist of the times. It's no longer an art, but in the 1950s, it was considered an art. And she saw him do this pantomime, forgot that I existed. So I was 18 or 17. I was heartbroken, and I had to write some music as a catharsis. So perhaps that's what's behind it. But I don't tell that in general, because when you hear a piece of music which is in general abstract, the listener should be able to make up their own mind, their own story. But now that you ask me, I'll tell you the secret.
Thank you.
So that was like your Berlioz heartbreak.
I guess so.
Because there are elements that do feel narrative in that piece. Yeah.
Yes.
Other questions? Well, we're just about out of time anyway, so I want to encourage everybody to check out this book, which is going to have a lot of great stories in it, and kind of tell the history of the 20th century, at least the late 20th century, the second part of the 20th century, as well as some of the first part of the 20th century, since a lot of the figures who were your teachers and your mentors were some of the most important conductors of the early part of the 20th century, like Monteux and Stokowski, who many people know from Fantasia, but who did an extraordinary amount for American composers. And of course, your history of recordings also tells a story about music from all the way from the Baroque and classic period through contemporary music as well as your own. So thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do for music. And if people want to get in touch, I suppose hopefully we can. If people think of other questions, maybe we'll send them along to you. as they think of them, because not everybody thinks well right in the moment. But I know a lot of these they all think deeply about music and are really quite extraordinary young musicians in their own right. So, so thank you so much, Maestro, for sharing your thoughts and your music with us. And we give you the clap symbol wherever it is on the computer. I don't know.
I think about Thank you.
Much love to Carol and to your family. And
As you know, she's a great admirer of yours. Not only as a composer,
well,
but
likewise.
she considered the best clarinetist today. Okay, so she reminds me all the time. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being there in the school. They are so lucky to have you. Thank you, Director.
And we're lucky to have Grace. Thank you, Grace, for putting everything together as usual. And as I said, you know, if there's questions, we'll pass them along to Maestro Serebrier. And thanks a lot. And I'll see you all a little bit later today as we continue our Odyssey, Composer Odyssey. Okay, so many thanks. Best wishes to you.
All the best. All the best to everyone. Good luck in everything. I am at your service if you need me for anything, all of you.
Thank you.